The walls of the Arctic Ice Research Facility held the cold like a secret. A year and a half, and I still wasn't used to it. Day after day, I'd watch the temperature on the monitors dip to levels that would make anyone second-guess their life choices. Not that I was the sentimental type. I'd signed up for this knowing it was no cozy academic posting. But I'd be lying if I said the cold didn't feel like it was creeping under my skin. Today, like every other, I made my rounds. The facility was a network of metal corridors and reinforced panels, holding back a world of ice and pressure just waiting to swallow us whole. I scanned the seismic data feeds, skimming over the lines that showed the usual tremors and shifts. Up until recently, it was textbook stuff, the kind of data I could interpret with my eyes shut. But a week ago, the readings had shifted. The tremors became patterned. They were subtle, but the frequency and intervals were off. Too even. It was as if something was tapping on the ice from below. I didn't give it much thought at first. I filed a report, mentioned it to a couple of the guys, and went about my day. We'd had odd readings before, and in an environment as hostile as this, things tended to go wrong. Small malfunctions, glitches in the systems. I figured it was just another anomaly in a long line of them. Then Dr. Blake went missing. It wasn't like him to wander off without saying anything. The man was a stickler for routine, down to marking every 10-minute coffee break in his logs. When he didn't show up to the mess hall, I figured he'd holed himself up in one of the labs, maybe gotten too absorbed in a project. But when the hours ticked by and he didn't respond to any comms, I started to worry. I did a quick check on the CCTV, only to find the feed was corrupted. Blank spots, shadows that seemed to move even in the empty halls. I watched the footage over and over, looking for any sign of Blake. Nothing. It was like he'd just walked into the ice. That was day one. Day two, I lost contact with Dr. Parker. She was another steady hand, not the kind to disappear without a word. Her last logged entry was an audio recording. 3 words. "It's getting closer." After that, silence. I went back to the CCTV, and this time I found only static, laced with bursts of white noise. My pulse quickened. 2 people missing in as many days wasn't something I could brush off. Day 3, I lost Tate. He was the night shift guy, the last person I'd expect to go wandering off in the dark. But when I went down to check on his station, all I found was his data log, left open on the terminal. His last entry was just one line. "It knows we're here." I spent hours combing through every system, every log, trying to find some kind of explanation. But all I found were gaps. Data missing, logs wiped. It was like a black hole was eating through the base, taking people and information with it. That night, I was alone in the mess hall, nursing a cup of stale coffee. When I felt it, a tremor ran through the floor, sharp and sudden. I set down my mug, watching the ripples spread across the surface of the liquid. It wasn't like any of the tremors I'd felt before. This one felt almost like a signal. I checked the seismograph readings again, going over every line of data from the past week. The tremors had shifted again, becoming more frequent, almost like footsteps. I zoomed in on the data, noting the intervals. There was a rhythm to it, like something was moving down there, pacing. I did what any scientist would do. I documented everything. Every sound, every shift, every pulse of cold that seemed to seep deeper than usual. I recorded the tremors, ran simulations, tried to find some pattern, some explanation that made sense. But nothing about this was logical. It was as if something was under the ice, moving, reshaping itself. The next morning I went to check on the seismograph again. But this time, it was offline. Every system that could tell me what was happening below us had gone dark. The tremors had become more frequent and intense, but I was blind to what was causing them thanks to the offline seismograph. 3 people missing, communications down, and now even the sensors couldn't tell me what was out there. Blake, Parker, Tate. Each disappearance had left behind a trace, a line of cryptic notes that I kept replaying in my mind. "It's getting closer. It knows we're here. Their words consumed me, intensifying in my head and pushing aside logic. I told myself it was isolation, nothing more than the mind's way of filling in the blanks. But that didn't stop my pulse from kicking up a notch every time the tremors rolled through, making the whole place feel like it was breathing. It was on day 5 that I decided to investigate the lower levels. If there were answers, they had to be down there, closer to whatever was causing those movements. The lower levels were typically sealed off. They were mostly storage spaces, rarely used, kept under lock and key since the base's construction. But I overrode the locks, more out of desperation than anything else, and made my way down, flashlight in hand, the silence pressing in tighter with each step. The air was colder, even for this place. My breath left clouds in the air, visible against the thin beam of the flashlight. I'd been down here maybe once before, early in the assignment, but back then, it had been full of crates and supplies. Now, it was almost barren, as if someone had emptied it out. The walls here were showing signs of strain. Fissures ran down the metal panels, thin cracks that had spidered out over time, but some looked fresh, like they'd been forced open from below. I moved my flashlight over one of the cracks, feeling a sense of dread. It wasn't a structural flaw, it was deliberate. The walls had been forced outward, and beyond the crack I could see ice, pure opaque ice. A layer of frost crept up the metal panels, a thin sheen that hadn't been there before. As I moved further, I noticed a scattering of items on the floor. Parker's datapad buried under a layer of frost, screen shattered, its last entry still open. I crouched down, peering at the cracks in the glass, reading her final words. "Nothing above. It's below." I clicked off the pad, pocketing it. The words made little sense, but they were all I had to go on. I continued down the corridor, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight I could feel my knuckles turning white. The silence here was so complete, it felt almost manufactured, like something had snuffed out all sound. I strained to listen for any hint of movement, any hint of the others, but there was nothing. Just the constant hum of the bass and the rhythmic rumbling below my feet. The corridor led to a series of storage rooms, each one featuring thick metal doors. They were meant to withstand extreme conditions, designed to keep the cold out. But now, they looked like they'd been forced open from the inside. I nudged one of the doors with my foot, and it swung open, revealing a gaping hole in the floor, leading straight down into the ice. I hesitated, flashlight aimed at the darkness below. The hole was wide enough for a person to slip through, but there were no signs of struggle, no signs that anyone had climbed down or up, just clean, smooth ice, polished as though by some careful, meticulous hand. "Blake? Parker? Tate?" I called out, my voice sounding pathetically small against the icy walls. There was no answer, just the sound of my own breathing, shallow and uneven. The rumbling picked up again. I could feel it vibrating through the floor, a steady beat that was almost comforting in its rhythm, almost like breathing. I pulled out my proximity locator, a device that could track electronic signatures, hoping I could pick up something from one of their data pads or any of the equipment they'd had on them. But as I scanned the area, the locator showed nothing, just static. It was like something was blocking the signal, like the ice itself was swallowing up any trace of them. I dropped down into the hole, careful to keep my balance as my feet landed on slick, frozen ground. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a tunnel that stretched out in both directions, carved so smoothly it seemed almost surreal. The walls were perfectly rounded, the ice almost reflective. I could see traces of light bouncing back at me, my own face distorted in the icy mirror. I moved forward, each step echoing in the narrow tunnel, the ice seeming to amplify every sound. The rumbling was stronger down here, the vibrations running up through my legs into my chest. It felt like it was coming from all around me, from the very walls of the tunnel. I pressed a hand to the ice, feeling the cold seep into my skin, as if the ice was breathing, responding to my presence. I spotted something in the distance, an odd, flickering light. My first thought was that one of the facility's emergency lights had somehow found its way down here, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A faint glow emanated from within the ice, matching the rhythm of the rumbling like a heartbeat. The closer I got, the stronger it became. Embedded in the ice was an organic structure, a mass that looked like it was part of the ice, but not. It was almost fleshy, a twisting shape that looked disturbingly alive, with dark veins running through it, veins that pulsed and moved as though they were feeding off something within the ice. The thing was immense, stretching down into the depths with no visible end. I wanted to turn back, to get out of there, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. It was like staring at something primordial, something that didn't belong in this world. This was no ordinary ice formation. It was something that had been lying dormant under the ice for who knows how long. I backed away, nearly losing my footing on the slick ground. The rumbling intensified, each beat thundering through my body, louder and louder until I could feel it pounding in my skull. I managed to tear myself away, scrambling back through the tunnel, my mind racing with questions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this thing was, it knew I was there. It was watching me, tracking every step. I made it back up to the main corridor, slamming the storage room door shut behind me. I leaned against the metal, gasping for breath, trying to steady myself. I didn't understand what I'd seen, but one thing was certain. I wasn't alone. The moment I slammed the door shut behind me, I knew that whatever comfort I'd once drawn from these walls was gone. This place, with all its steel and technology, wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. The ice, that thing. It had been biding its time, watching. And now it was awake, consuming my team one by one. I didn't know how long I stood there, breath heaving, my heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted out. I tried to process what I'd seen in the tunnels. That mass in the ice. The veins, alive, moving, like the walls were pulsing with some ancient, dormant hunger. Whatever it was dragging my colleagues down, one by one, into the ice. There was no way I was going back down there without protection. I thought about the rifle we kept in storage. It was standard issue, meant for emergencies, which in this part of the world usually meant a rogue polar bear wandering too close. Not that anything had ever actually happened. In all our time here, we'd never had to touch it, but now I needed something to make me feel less like I was walking into my own grave. The storage room wasn't far, just a few turns down the main corridor. I pushed open the door, my flashlight gliding over rows of metal shelves crammed with supplies. I located the rifle, tucked away in a locked case, along with a box of ammunition. It was an old model, a bolt-action hunting rifle, but it was solid, reliable. I slung it over my shoulder, stuffing a few extra rounds into my jacket pocket, then checked the rest of the storage room for anything useful. Nothing else stood out. A few flares, some rope, the standard emergency kit. I grabbed what I could, loading my pockets with supplies. My fingers brushed over Parker's datapad, still in my jacket. I pulled it out, staring at the shattered screen, at her final words. Nothing above, it's below. They sent a chill through me, colder than the ice. I retraced my steps, following the same path I'd taken before, back down the cold, silent corridors and into the lower levels. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating frost-coated walls, the fine cracks that spidered across the metal and glass. The closer I got to the tunnels, the more the air seemed to change. It was colder down here, but there was something thick, something that made my skin crawl. Like the air was alive, buzzing with some barely contained energy. As I entered the tunnels again, my flashlight caught on something buried in the ice. I crouched down, pulling it free. A metal wristwatch, scratched and scuffed from years of wear. I recognized it immediately. It was Blake's, a relic from his father he'd worn every day. He'd joke that it kept time better than any of our fancy tech, and he never went anywhere without it. I held it in my hand, feeling the chill of the ice still clinging to the worn leather strap, Something had taken him, torn him away from every piece of familiarity he clung to in this frozen hell, and left this behind like a discarded husk. I kept moving, stepping carefully over slick patches, the ice crunching under my boots. Another 100 yards and I found Parker's thermos lying on its side, contents frozen solid. I remembered how she'd carry that thing around like a security blanket, clutching it during every break, filling it religiously with scalding tea. Seeing it here, abandoned, made my throat tighten. And then Tate's notebook, pages stiff and cracked with frost. He'd always joked about keeping a journal of madness out here, something to hand to his family if he ever made it back. I picked it up, flipping through the frozen pages, fragments of notes, half-finished thoughts. The last entry was smeared, barely legible, just a few words scrawled in his cramped handwriting. The walls, watching. I pushed forward, fingers tightening around the rifle. Every sound felt amplified down here. My own breathing, the scuff of my boots, the faint crackle of frost breaking beneath my weight. But beneath it all was the rumbling. It wasn't a tremor, not like the ones I'd felt before. This was constant, almost like a heartbeat. Suddenly, my flashlight caught on something that made my stomach twist. They were there, all three of them. Blake, Parker, Tate. But they weren't just lying there. No, it was worse than that. So much worse. Blake's body was half embedded in the ice wall, his upper torso protruding at a bizarre angle. His eyes were wide, glazed over, staring straight ahead but seeing nothing. His arm, twisted and broken, was fused with the ice, veins branching out from his wrist and disappearing into the wall like roots. Parker was next to him, one leg sticking out of the wall, the rest of her body sunken into the ice. Her hand was reaching out, as if she'd been clawing, trying to escape. But the ice had swallowed her. The flesh on her arms stretched and melded into the cold, veins pulsing under the surface. Her face was barely visible, distorted beneath the frost, frozen in terror. And Tate, he was the worst. His body was almost entirely encased, with only his head and one hand visible. His fingers pressed against the wall, his face locked in a grimace of pain. And beneath the ice, running through his flesh, I could see the same dark veins, the same grotesque organic matter that I'd seen in the tunnels, winding through their bodies, fusing them with the ice. They weren't just dead. They were absorbed, their bodies twisted and contorted, frozen in place as though the ice itself had claimed them. The walls were alive, feeding on them, devouring them. I took a step back, bile rising in my throat, my grip tightening on the rifle. This wasn't natural. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen or imagined. It was as though the ice had taken them, drawn them in, merging their flesh with itself, feeding off them. The sight of them, my colleagues, my friends, fused into the ice, trapped forever in grotesque silence, made my mind reel. But horror quickly turned to fury. Whatever this thing was, it had taken them, and it was trying to take me. I wouldn't let it. I couldn't save them, but I wasn't about to let myself get swallowed up in this frozen hell without a fight. I took a flare from my pocket, gritting my teeth as I cracked it open and let it burst to life, its orange glow casting wild shadows on the icy walls. The heat radiated out instantly, warming my face in a way that felt almost alien out here in the depths of the cold. I shoved the flare forward, pressing it as close as I dared to the exposed flesh in the ice. The twisted veins that seemed to wind through my colleagues' bodies now pulsed faster, like they were aware of the heat. The reaction was immediate. The fleshy material sizzled and bubbled, releasing clouds of dark, oily gas that billowed out, filling the tunnel with a rotten stench. The smell hit me, forcing bile up my throat. I gagged, choking on the fumes, but held the flare steady, letting it scorch as much of the exposed flesh as possible. The wall seemed to hiss and writhe, like it was in pain, as the surface began to blister and melt. I stumbled back as the scorched flesh began to drip off the wall, blackened chunks of it splattering onto the icy floor. The dripping mass started pooling, shifting, moving as if it had a mind of its own. The thick, tar-like substance twisted and coiled, reshaping itself into small, shapeless forms. They moved, advancing towards me with a sickening purpose, each mass no bigger than a rat but pulsing. Alive with that same disturbing energy I'd felt throughout the tunnels. "Damn it!" I muttered, aiming my rifle at the nearest mass. I fired, the shot echoing off the walls, and the bullet ripped through the creature, tearing it apart. But it didn't stop the others. More of them formed from the melted flesh, dripping steadily from the scorched wall like some twisted faucet left on full blast. Each mass that hit the floor would squirm and pull itself together, advancing in my direction. I fired again and again, each bullet taking down one or two of the creatures, but there were too many. Every shot rang in my ears, the casing bouncing off the ice at my feet, but the shapeless things kept forming, each one creeping toward me with the same unrelenting drive. I backed away, trying to keep my aim steady, but it was pointless. Each creature I shot down was quickly replaced, the melted, fleshy substance dripping faster, pooling and collecting, crawling toward me. Sweat ran down my face, freezing on my skin as fast as it formed, but I kept firing, emptying round after round until I could feel the rifle getting warm in my hands, the metal heating up from the repeated shots. I knew I couldn't keep this up. I was losing. I was outnumbered, trapped in a tunnel with a mass that just wouldn't stop. And as I glanced up, I saw that my colleagues were gone. The wall had finished its horrific task, fully absorbing them into itself, leaving no trace but a faint shadow behind the ice, an outline of where they'd once been. They were part of it now, fully claimed by whatever had been lurking here all along. There was nothing left to save, nothing to bring back. I took one last look at the shapeless masses advancing toward me, their movements unstoppable, the entire wall seeming to pulse as if taunting me with my failure. No way I was ending up like them, caught in the ice, devoured alive by whatever this thing was. I turned, bolting down the tunnel, my boots slipping on the ice as I pushed myself to move faster, to put as much distance as possible between myself and those monstrous things. My heart was pounding in my ears by the time I made it back up to the main corridor, and I slammed the heavy door shut behind me, jamming a piece of metal through the handle to secure it. The pounding in my chest slowed as I leaned against the wall, catching my breath, and I realized just how close I'd come to joining them. I didn't waste any time. Whatever was down there wasn't just dangerous, it was spreading, expanding. Those veins in the walls, those twisted growths. They weren't staying below the ice. They were coming for the base. The facility had enough explosive power to clear whole sections of ice for research. I knew that equipment was here for a reason, but right now, I was about to use it for something entirely different. I made my way to the storage room, every step solid and focused. If I couldn't contain this thing, I'd make sure it never left this place. Whatever was down there, whatever had claimed my team, it wasn't getting out. And if I had to take the whole facility down with it, so be it. I headed to the equipment storage, grabbing the charges. They were powerful enough to blast through solid ice, intended for geological studies, creating new tunnels when needed. Now, they were about to serve a new purpose. I shoved everything I could into my pack, as much food, water, and fuel as I could carry, my rifle, extra ammunition, a flare gun, and our portable radio. If I made it out, I'd need every resource available to survive until help came. I sent out a quick message on the base comms, repeating the grim status. Uncontained biological threat, station compromised, preparing for full evacuation and detonation. The explosives were bulky, but I took my time, setting each one carefully at key points around the base. First, I placed charges near the generator to ensure there'd be no power left to contain or sustain whatever was below. I set another round near the entrance of the main tunnel, sealing off the depths of ice and flesh with as much explosive power as I could muster. Finally, I rigged charges around the supply rooms and living quarters. I wanted every inch of this place to collapse, burning in the snow. At the base's entrance, I pulled out the radio and held it close. I pressed down the button, sending out what I knew might be my last transmission. "This is Dr. Jacob Ford of Arctic Research Station 19. The facility has been compromised. Biological threat within the ice. Initiating emergency evacuation. Coordinates are logged. God help us. I listened to the static, half hoping someone would answer, but there was nothing. Just the cold, empty hiss. I slung my pack over my shoulder, stepping out into the barren expanse beyond the base. A few miles out, the terrain broke into rocky outcrops and scattered caves, enough cover, hopefully, to shield me from the blast. I kept moving, counting my steps to keep track of the distance. When I'd made it far enough, I stopped and took one last look at the station. My home for the past year. A place that had once been filled with the sounds of my colleagues, of laughter and work. Now it was just an empty shell, corrupted by whatever lay beneath. With one final breath, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the detonator. The explosion tore through the silence, the shockwave knocking me back a few steps. Fire burst through the base, roaring up and out, a bright plume of smoke and flame rising against the endless white. I shielded my eyes, watching as the structure collapsed in on itself, steel and ice breaking apart, everything swallowed by flames. The fire burned through the cold, and for a moment I could almost feel warmth radiating across the snow. Whatever that thing was, it was gone now, sealed under tons of burning ice and rubble. I turned and kept moving. A few miles out, I found a shallow cave nestled in a cluster of rocky hills, protected from the harshest winds. It wasn't much, but it would be shelter enough. I unpacked my supplies, arranging the food and water, setting up my fuel reserve in a corner. I unrolled a thermal blanket, draping it over myself, and placed the radio by my side, the static crackling in the silence. Every few hours I tried the radio, repeating the same message. "This is Dr. Jacob Ford. Arctic Research Station 19 destroyed. Biological threat contained. Requesting immediate rescue." I listened for a response. Any sign of life on the other end, but nothing came through. Just the empty hiss of static. Days passed. I rationed the food, careful to stretch out every bite, every sip of water. The radio stayed at my side, my only connection to the world beyond this frozen wasteland. I checked it regularly, trying different frequencies, desperate for any response. But every time, the same silence greeted me. I found myself talking to the radio, my voice filling the cave, trying to break the crushing isolation. On the 5th day, the snow was beginning to creep into the cave, and I could feel the cold biting at my bones, sinking deeper with each night. My rations were down to nearly nothing, and each sip of water felt like it barely scratched the thirst. I pulled my knees to my chest, the radio balanced on my lap, fingers numb as I pressed the button one last time. "This is Dr. Jacob Ford. Arctic Research Station 19 destroyed. Biological threat contained. Requesting immediate rescue. Please, if anyone's there." I let go of the button, releasing a shaky breath as I listened to the static, bracing myself for the emptiness I'd come to expect. But this time, the silence broke. A faint crackle came through the speaker, and then a voice, clear and steady. "Dr. Ford, this is Rescue Team Alpha. We've received your signal. Hold tight, we're on our way." My heart nearly stopped. I pressed the button again, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Copy that, Rescue Team Alpha. Coordinates locked, awaiting rescue." I leaned back against the cold stone of the cave, staring at the radio, as though expecting it to disappear like some trick of the mind. But the voice was real, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in days. Relief crashed over me, sudden and overwhelming, filling the space where hope had all but died. Minutes passed, and then, through the blur of white outside the cave, I saw a tracked vehicle, an Arctic crawler, its heavy treads grinding through the snow. It pulled up in front of the cave, and 2 figures bundled in thermal suits climbed out, moving toward me. I stood, every muscle in my body stiff and numb, but I managed to raise my hand, a simple gesture, but one that felt like a lifeline. One of the rescuers waved back, approaching. His gloved hand reached out, gripping my shoulder, the gesture firm and steady. They guided me into the warmth of the vehicle's cabin, where the heat wrapped around me, thawing the cold that had settled into my bones. As we pulled away from the cave, I glanced back at the distant plume of smoke where the base had once stood. Whatever had been lurking beneath the ice was buried now, sealed under tons of rubble, fire, and frozen earth. I sank back into the seat, closing my eyes as the crawler cut through the snow, the hum of the engine a welcome sound, solid and real. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. I had survived. The return to civilization was surreal. After days of silence and cold isolation in that cave, the bustling sounds and lights of the Antarctic outpost base felt overwhelming. People spoke to me, gave me updates, medical checks, reassurances, but it all washed over me like background noise. My mind was somewhere else, still trapped in that frozen tomb I'd left behind, haunted by the faces of my colleagues fused into the walls of ice. Back at the main outpost, I was immediately whisked into debriefings. Representatives from multiple agencies, government, scientific organizations, and security teams filed in and out of the small room where I was stationed. They asked questions in controlled, professional tones. But as soon as I started talking about what I had seen in the tunnels, the pulsing veins, the organic matter, the final moments of my colleagues, an uncomfortable silence would settle over the room. They avoided looking directly at me, scribbling notes without comment, their expressions unreadable. Each question felt more impersonal than the last, as though I were describing a malfunction in a piece of equipment rather than recounting a horror I'd barely escaped. Eventually, they stopped asking questions altogether. The officials shared a few words with each other in hushed tones, then handed me a set of documents and an official seal marked "Classified." They told me the investigation was being shut down, all files and findings sealed. I was ordered to sign a non-disclosure agreement, warned that any details I revealed would be a breach of national security. This wasn't an option, it was a directive. The words biological contamination and public safety were used, but it was clear this wasn't just about security. This was about erasing the entire existence of Research Station 19. After that, the missions to the Antarctic stopped entirely. Officially, the decision was attributed to budget cuts and increased safety concerns. But I knew the truth. Research Station 19, once part of a worldwide climate initiative, had been shut down and removed from records as if it had never existed. The agency went so far as to dismantle other sites in the region, announcing a reallocation of resources. But everyone there that day knew the real reason. Whatever was buried under the ice was not meant to be disturbed. They wanted it sealed, buried, and forgotten. I returned to the city a month later. I thought I'd be glad to come back, to feel normal again, but instead I felt like a stranger in my own life. I tried to slip back into my old habits, resume my routines, hoping I could convince myself I was still the man I had been before the ice. But I was changed, as surely as my colleagues had been. Only I was left on this side of the nightmare. I took long walks at night, circling empty streets. Every dark alley felt like the tunnels, every shadow a reminder of that pulsing, alive darkness beneath the ice. It got worse with time. I began to see shapes in the shadows, small, shapeless masses slithering toward me, crawling across sidewalks and alleys. I'd blink, and they'd be gone, leaving me standing there, heart racing, feeling foolish. But the fear lingered, impossible to shake. I couldn't talk about it to anyone, not even friends. I had rehearsed explanations, quick, believable stories that glossed over the truth, but as soon as I opened my mouth, the memories hit me all over again. The stench of burning flesh, the lifeless eyes of my colleagues fused into the ice, the sound of that last, hopeless message I'd left on the radio. How could anyone understand? So I buried it, following the agency's orders to keep quiet, to pretend it never happened. I found myself drifting between odd jobs, unable to stay in one place, avoiding anyone who might ask too many questions about why I'd left. I couldn't go back to research. Every time I saw an image of a snowy expanse or an article about Antarctic expeditions, my heart would start pounding, cold sweat gathering on my skin. I'd close the laptop or walk away, the feeling too intense to ignore. The nightmares became routine. I'd wake in a cold sweat, certain I could still hear the faint rumbling of something moving below me, feel the oppressive, cold press of the ice, as though it were dragging me back into its depths. I started keeping a flare by my bedside. It was absurd, but it was the only thing that let me sleep, knowing I had some form of light and heat close by. Months passed this way, my life slowly unraveling. I stopped seeing friends, cut ties with family, afraid I'd let something slip. Then one day, I received a letter from the agency, a cold, impersonal memo informing me that my name and credentials would be removed from all official records related to the expedition. All research, all accomplishments, all erased. To the world, it was as if I had never been there. I crumpled the letter in my fist, feeling a wave of anger and despair. But what good was anger against something I couldn't fight, couldn't even prove existed? I went to a therapist once, trying to explain without explaining, hinting at the anxiety and the isolation I was feeling. But when they started talking about trauma and stress management, it felt so trivial, so far removed from what I'd seen, that I walked out mid-session and never went back. In the end, I accepted that this was my life now. A ghost, haunted by memories no one would ever believe. I was left with fragments. The sound of dripping flesh, the static hiss of the radio, the twisted outline of bodies in the ice. The horror of it all lingered, a permanent scar on my mind. I stopped thinking of the Arctic as a place on a map, somewhere real and concrete. To me, it became something more, a memory, a warning, a graveyard of secrets frozen beneath the ice. And so I faded into my life, my routine becoming my only solace. But some nights when I closed my eyes, I still saw it. The ice walls, the veins, and those eyes frozen wide with terror staring back at me as if to say, "You can bury the truth, but you can never escape it."